So we're really pleased to have Pete with us this week. He was an Oxford student himself. He studied PPE here, did undergrad and postgrad, and he also got himself 3 blues in rugby, which is pretty impressive during his time here. Since then, he's worked in Christians in Sport and working with supporting professional athletes, and he's now a senior minister at a church in London. But we're going to continue in the random fact about Pete series that we started yesterday. So the random fact for today is that in Pete's pursuit of pleasure, he ended up doing a full Olympic skeleton bob run in Germany. So perhaps he's more qualified to speak on this subject than we first thought. I'm going to hand over to him now.
Thanks, Alice, very much. If you want the full story about that, then please come and grab me at the end. Let me just say that I'd always thought before that run that the phrase going weak at the knees, I just thought it was a metaphor. And then when I did that run and I stood up at the end of it, I fell straight over again. And I realised it's not a metaphor, it's what happens when you're terrified. So that's what's going on. Can I just say, to start off with, thank you so much for those of you who have been kind enough to fill out some of these feedback forms. We really do take on some of your feedback, and most of it's been really helpful. There is some unique feedback you just get in the fact that you're in a university like Oxford. So here's one that I didn't quite expect, but you see what you make of this. Any other comments? Yeah, minor point, but Pete, check the Public Order Act 1956 information. The word insulting has been removed by an amending act. I think it comes into force earlier this year. So that's the type of detail you only get in Oxford. You don't get that anywhere else. And then this, I just think this is a borderline for an abuse of the form. Any other comments? Yes. Is the phone number on the screen Alice's personal number, and is she single? That's not what it's for. That's not what it's for. Behave yourself. Okay. Pleasure is believing boring. As we've been going through the week, if you've been with us, then we looked on the Thursday at relevance. Why does Christianity matter? Then we looked on the second day at truth. How can we know the truth about anything, particularly how can we know the truth about Christianity? And we said as soon as we started to deal with that issue of what is true in our present climate, the issue of tolerance comes up straight away. So on the third day, yesterday, we looked at tolerance. And I put it forward that because of the uniqueness of the person of Jesus Christ, as the Bible describes him in John chapter 1, verse 14, being full of grace and truth, that there are unique resources within the Christian worldview to be able to engage with people in a proper debate about truth, but in a way that doesn't override them and make out that they lack any value if they don't agree with you, but actually affirms their dignity and value and is able to bring this virtue of respect into the public sphere as we debate about these things. So we're now looking today at pleasure because as we think about Christianity, you might be starting to think, well, okay, maybe I might even start to think there might be something in it. I might start to think that it might be true, but one of the big barriers might be that you look at it and you think, the problem is it would just be such a boring or restricted life if I were to become a Christian that frankly I find it existentially a bit of a turn-off. I just don't want anything to do with it. So hence our question, is believing boring? Now, I'm not sure whether or not it's particularly because Oxford has done so well in the varsity match the last few years, but normally when you come on these week of talks, one of the questions that gets dealt with is the problem of pain or the problem of suffering. You've substituted in the problem of pleasure. Now, I mean, the last 4 varsity matches in rugby, you've won all 4 of them by a point of 108 to 54 points. If you're here from Cambridge, welcome. Feel at home here, and I'm glad that we're shellacking you at the moment. It makes me very happy as an ex-rugby player myself. But we look at this issue of pleasure because, interestingly, now it seems to be an almost bigger issue philosophically than the issue of pain. You know, our pursuit of pleasure, and actually, are we going to accept any worldview that doesn't seem to offer us the pleasure that we long for? Let's try and understand the issue first of all. And I think we need to go back a little bit in history first of all to understand where it's come from. So it's recent in the last 250 years or so that the pursuit of pleasure and the avoidance of pain has become one of the supreme goods in society. You might be familiar with the writings of the Romantics, for example, Byron and Shelley. Shelley wrote this in his Speculation on Morals. He wrote, "That is called good, which produces pleasure. That is called evil, which produces pain." So he's trying to define good and bad, or good and evil, according to whether it produces pleasure or whether it produces pain. This was articulated for society by Jeremy Bentham, who said, nature has placed mankind under the governance of two sovereign masters, pain and pleasure. So our ethics are to be governed by the pursuit of pleasure and the avoidance of pain. Our society is to be governed by the pursuit of pleasure and the avoidance of pain. And then Freud, about 100 years after that, developed his pleasure principle, where he argued that the purpose of all life, or all human life, the driving force of the id, is the instinctual seeking of pleasure and the avoidance of pain. So you see what we've got here. We've got ethics being defined according to the pursuit of pleasure and the avoidance of pain. We've got society getting its shape according to the pursuit of pleasure and the avoidance of pain. And now we've got emotional or psychological health being defined according to the pursuit of pleasure and the avoidance of pain. And the problem is that when you come into the realm of Christianity, it's just very clear, a cursory reading of the description of the way that Christians are called to live under the lordship of Jesus Christ, uses words like restraint or self-control. So whereas our age says, if it feels good, do it, Christians are called to not just go with whatever they desire, but to restrain some of their desires. Our age might have a rampant consumerism. Christians are called to fast and to abstain. Incidentally, fasting's become in vogue in London because of a new fasting diet where you can lose weight by fasting 2 days a week and eating for 5 days a week. It became just a new thing. I might want to push back a little bit and say that fasting's been around just before the dieting kind of phenomenon, but there we go. Our culture says you can sleep with who you want. Christianity, in the old translation of the King James Version, would use the word chastity for a sexual restraint, a sense of waiting for the right time in the right context. Culture says if it feels good, do it. Jesus teaches the importance of self-control. And now what I want to suggest as we go through this talk is that the pursuit of pleasure is a good thing, but if you take it on its own, it becomes a very thin concept, a very thin concept. In fact, it becomes a dangerous concept if you take it as the only virtue. It needs to instead come into a kind of an integrated relationship between two other things. Pleasure needs to be integrated with ethics, how should I live, and purpose, what is the point of life. When you have those three things together, you get what the Bible calls joy. As the writer 1 Peter puts it, joy inexpressible and filled with glory. But if you take ethics and purpose out of pleasure and just pursue pleasure, I think it takes us down a very dangerous path. That's where we're going as we think about it. The writer G.K. Chesterton said that meaninglessness does not come from being weary of pain. Meaninglessness comes from being weary of pleasure. And I want to just think a bit for the moment about the dissatisfaction with pleasure as the supreme good, because I think if we look around our society, we see it. Now, we've got to be honest, in our culture, we've had some major strides forward when it comes to kind of a consumer experience. So, you remember the old Burger King advert? You want it your way, you got it. You know, the idea being you could kind of pimp up your burger, get it exactly the way you wanted it. And now you go into Starbucks, and of course they have signature coffee or signature lattes. You know, you get it the way you want. Incidentally, is it only me who finds it mildly weird when they ask for your name? You know, when they ask you for your name, what's your name? And you kind of think, I don't know you. And then you kind of give them your name, and then they make you laugh, and they go, Pete, is there a Pete here? And now everybody in the coffee shop knows your name. You haven't met anybody. Incidentally, if you're having a really boring day, you know you can just invent a name. Just be something different for the day. What's your name? Montgomery. And then when they call it out, Montgomery, is there Montgomery here? You get to stride up and be Montgomery for the day. Why don't we all try that? Subvert Starbucks. But the idea with consumerism is you want it your way, you've got it. And we have tailored browser experiences on the internet so that because of the cookies that are being sampled, the idea is that the right pages come up for you. You know, they tailor the products to you. Incidentally, in the realm of kind of physical consumerism in the shops, there are now some mannequins, this freaks me out, there are some mannequins which have cameras hidden in their eyes, and they track you as a shopper. This is true, it's really happening. They track you as a shopper to observe your browsing habits as you go around the store. They feed the information in, and then they restructure the store the next time that people come in to try to make it more user-friendly. Is it just me that finds that mildly freaky? The idea that a mannequin is watching you. I always thought they were watching me, now I know they really are. Consumerism. Everything is the way that we want it. And yet, despite all this, and Andy talked a little bit about this in the last 2 nights, sociologically, one of the things that is coming up is that there is more psychological ill health out there than ever before. So there's an interesting online magazine called Salon, and a guy called Bruce Levine, who's a psychologist and a social commentator, writes a really interesting article called How Our Society Breeds Anxiety, Depression and Dysfunction. It's a kind of happy piece that you want to read early in the morning. But interestingly in it, it is a very profound piece, and he makes a fearless inventory of our increasing mental health problems in the West, particularly in the USA. He notes that the rates of depression are 10 to 20 times higher than 50 years ago. And he notes this: even with mainstream psychiatry, there are few, if any, who continue to argue that the increase in this is due to a prior underdiagnosis of disorders, or that psychiatry is merely now pathologizing previously normal behavior. He says, look, it's not that we're measuring it now and we didn't measure it before. It's equally not that we're calling things as a psychological ill health that we didn't measure before. There really is an objective increase of mental disorders in society. Now, what is really interesting in the article is where he goes with the solution to it. Because lots of people are grappling with this at the moment. My sister-in-law is a doctor of psychology. My mother-in-law is a psychiatrist, so we have a very healthy family, as you can imagine. Family debates are great fun in our family. You're projecting? No, you're projecting on me, and if we don't know. But he writes this. His thesis is that mental illness has come about unusually as a rebellion against society. Listen to this. Society has, in its radical consumerism and pursuit of pleasure, unwittingly been dehumanized. The increase in mental illness is everything inside us rising up, trying to alert us to this problem. It's a very interesting comment. He's saying that the problem is that as we pursue pleasure and as we pursue consumerism, we're kind of becoming less human. And we don't realize it, but on a deep psychological level, we're aware that something's not right, that something doesn't quite stack up. And so everything in us is rising up, trying to bring the problem to the surface. I wonder what you make of that. And I just want to take some time as we think about this, because of course we've been saying that we get our truth from the Bible all the way through, to notice an interaction that Jesus has with a woman who's going through this kind of issue. It happens in John chapter 4. She's often known as the woman at the well. Now it's interesting that Jesus has been walking in the heat of the day, and he encounters this woman as he comes about midday to this well to get a drink. And he starts up a conversation with her, which is very unusual for 2 reasons. First of all, she's a woman. It's a very patriarchal, society, so a man would not normally talk to a woman in society in public at all. Second unusual thing is she's a Samaritan. In fact, Jesus is in the area of Samaria, and the Jews hated the Samaritans. So he starts talking to her, which is very, very strange. It is also strange that she's at the well drawing water at midday, because the women would always go very early in the morning, as they do in Africa still today, because that's when it's coolest, and so it's not so hot to carry the water. So we'll come to the reason why she's avoiding the crowds of women and why she goes later on when they've all finished drawing the water. But he strikes up a conversation with her. He asks her for water, and she kind of basically says, well, don't you have a bucket to draw your own? And then he turns and says something rather unusual to her. He said, if you knew who I was, you would be asking me for water. And that's kind of unusual, because he's asked her for water, and she's thinking, why are you asking me for water? But she kind of, she's intrigued by this, and she says, okay. And he then turns to her and says, the water that I'm offering you will take away your thirst. It will completely take away your thirst. Now she's intrigued at this moment. She says, well, that'd be a neat trick. If you could offer me the type of water that meant I never got thirsty again, I wouldn't need to keep doing this drudgery of a routine, coming up here every day to draw the water from this well. Yeah, she says, okay, I'm buying, I'm playing your game. I'd be interested in that type of water. And then Jesus says something astonishing to her. He says, go and get your husband. Now, that's a bit a sharp thing to say to her, because this woman has been pursuing pleasure in a pursuit of a number of unfulfilling relationships and sexual encounters. Jesus later shows that he knows what's been going on. He says to her, you're right that you have no husband. You've had 5 previous ones, and the 6th man you're with is not even your husband. Now here's what's astonishing about Jesus. He manages to say this in a way that doesn't cause her to slap him or run away or just leave him alone. He's gracious enough, but he confronts her with it. Why is he doing that? He's pointing out to her that she has been pursuing pleasure but she's been doing it outside of any moral framework at all. She's been saying, my number one thing is pleasure, and I've been pursuing it with men. And he's saying, hasn't it just left you feel like you're constantly drinking seawater? You take a drink, and then you want some more again. You're never satisfied, you're always thirsty. And I wonder if some of us are starting to realise that as we pursue pleasure in our society, the bottom line of consumerism is not that it satisfies us, it leaves us wanting more. Russell Brand, I think, is a fascinating guy because he talks very frankly about the experience of being a celebrity. And he talks very frankly about the fact that he pursued being a celebrity purely for the reason that he wanted to be a celebrity, not for any other reason. And I think our kind of relationship with fame and celebrity is like our relationship with consumerism. It leaves people wanting more. In an interview with Jeremy Paxman, this is what he said about being a celebrity. There's the initial thrill of achievement. Oh my word, it's arrived. The same as if you acquired a pair of shoes that you long craved. And then you realise they're too tight. They're not as good as you hoped they would be as you walk around in them. And you realise you need nutrition from a higher source. You need something more valuable. Celebrity is like being presented with an absolutely glorious meal, and then when you eat it, you realise that it is utterly vacuous. There's no taste, there's no succour, there's no nutrition. It's tiresome. There's nothing wrong with consumerism. There's nothing wrong with the pursuit of pleasure. But if you just pursue it on its own, I wonder whether you've started to notice in our society that we find it tiresome. There's got to be more to life than this. And one of the reasons is that we're pursuing pleasure divorced from morality, because pleasure can't be just paired off on its own. We have to pursue pleasure within the moral framework that God has given us. And when we don't do that, we break ourselves on the right moral boundaries that God has given us. Now, here's the problem. We often think that there are no moral boundaries. We're a postmodern generation, and we think that when we put in moral boundaries, it's just going to constrain us. But you see, freedom, real freedom, is not the absence of moral boundaries. Real freedom is realised within those moral boundaries. Let me try to explain what I mean. Imagine that I said, look, I find the law of gravity just far too constraining. I'm not going to live according to the law of gravity anymore. And so here and right now, I climbed up around here onto this balcony and I said, I'm going to demonstrate that I don't believe in the law of gravity anymore to express my freedom. And I shouted, Geronimo, as I pulled a kind of pose like Superman and tried to crowd surf. Now you, being sensible Oxford students, would move out the way and I would land in a kind of belly flop painfully on the floor, causing myself all manner of broken ribs and things like that. All I would have done is demonstrate the law of gravity whilst breaking myself. Is it possible that as we try to shake our fist at moral boundaries and say, I'm going to pursue freedom, we are demonstrating the moral boundaries whilst breaking ourselves on them? This woman in John chapter 4 has been doing exactly that. God talks about the right context for a romantic sexual relationship. She's been saying, I'll pursue pleasure in the absence of those boundaries. They don't apply to me. And it's left her destitute. The reason that she's not with the other women early in the morning is they won't have a thing to do with her anymore. In a shame society, they've ostracized her. So she's found out that the bottom line for all of her pursuit of pleasure has been dissatisfaction, disillusionment, and breaking off from society. She's lonely, she's on her own. Midday doing that daily drudgery backwards and forwards between the well. Is it possible that in our pursuit of pleasure, outside of God's good moral boundaries, we are finding that? Malcolm Muggeridge was a journalist, and he became a Christian later on in his life. And he wrote a stunning biography. I definitely recommend the autobiography. I recommend that you read it. And in it, he's very, very candid. And one of the key moments in him coming to faith in Christ was something that happened to him when he was traveling and was around the world in the pursuit of truth as a journalist. He writes that he had always had this illicit fantasy that whilst he was away from his wife and his family, he would somehow manage to have an affair that they would never find out about. And so he was, as a journalist, he was in India, and he wandered out one morning to the river Ganges, and it was very early in the morning in the half-light, and he saw an Indian woman bathing in the Ganges, and he thought to himself, well, I'm a wealthy Westerner, she's a poor Indian woman, there's no way that she'll refuse my advances, this is my moment. And so he strips off and he gets into the water and he swims across towards her. And as he draws near to her and the light is clearing a little bit, she turns around stunned because there's another person in the water, and then even more stunned, it's a Westerner and it's a man. So she's utterly shocked. But he is more shocked because as she turns and faces him, he realizes that she is a leper and that her face has got horrendous scars from her disease. And then the moment catches him and goes across his head. Though however ugly she is, the ugliness of his soul at that moment is far, far uglier. It was a key moment in him starting to realize what happens when you try to pursue pleasure outside of the boundaries that God gives us. The ugliness of his own soul. And I just wonder whether there are many people in our society who are pursuing pleasure but don't know the simplest pleasure of all, of when your head hits the pillow at night, your conscience is clean. You don't worry about whether someone sees your browser history. You don't worry about the skeletons hidden in the closet. You have a clean conscience because you're living according to God's good moral framework for your life. The simplest pleasure of all. Some of us have such an inner restlessness, and I know we present well here. We've learnt it. We present so well, but inside, we know there are things that we'd die if people saw. And what is interesting with this woman in John chapter 4 is the way that the encounter with Jesus ends. After she has encountered Jesus, after she has experienced firsthand the unique acceptance and grace that he alone brings, she runs back to the town and she says a stunning thing. Verse 28, she says, "Come see a man who told me all that I ever did." Can you imagine what the rest of the town thought? They must have thought, "We know what you do. That's the issue. It's pretty clear what you've been doing. You're a homewrecker." But she's no longer ashamed anymore because she's been forgiven. Someone has said that if you get acceptance from one important enough person in the world, all the other rejections are put into perspective. She receives acceptance from Jesus Christ and her conscience is washed clean, and she receives a reintegration back in society. That is real pleasure. The pleasure of a clear conscience. So the danger of pleasure divorced from morality, but the wonder when pleasure comes back into a harmony integrated with pursuit of life and joy in a proper moral framework. And lastly, the despair of pleasure divorced from purpose. Dostoevsky wrote, "The secret of man's being is not only to live, but to live for something definite." And I just wonder whether so much of our pursuit of pleasure is a form of escapism. Now don't get me wrong, it's fine sometimes, tune in and tune out and, go to the cinema and do that. But I don't know, have you ever seen the cartoon Wall-E? The cartoon Wall-E, Wall-E ends up, what human beings are like in the cartoon Wall-E? They're these kind of obese, blobs that go around on chairs that take them everywhere, and they kind of suck their milkshakes, and they have a screen in front of them all the time. And, I remember being at the cinema and watching Wall-E and thinking, that is, that's just very funny, we're not like that at all. And then looking round as, my friend next to me was there, rocked back with, his kind of, he can rest his milkshake on his belly. And he was kind of sucked his milkshake, and I looked at him and I looked at the screen and we were chuckling, and I thought, whoa, that's just a little bit too close for comfort. Are we becoming like the parody that we so pursue pleasure, but we don't do it as we pursue purpose as well? You see, why is it that people will often go through great hardship for the pursuit of something greater? They'll forego pleasure sometimes. Athletes do it, adventurers do it, those who invest in their careers do it, parents do it. We'll go through pain often. We're happy to have pain because there's a pursuit of a higher goal. So much pursuit of pleasure today has a kind of escapism to it because we don't know what we're really here for. And what is interesting in this encounter with Jesus is that the woman tries to deflect. So at a certain point she turns to Jesus and she's saying this is getting a little bit too close for comfort. So she says, she thinks, I'll introduce a kind of parochial debate that was going on between the Jews and the Samaritans, and that'll throw him off the scent. So she says to him, "Well, sir, I perceive you're a prophet. Our fathers worshipped on this mountain, but you Jews say that in Jerusalem is the place where people ought to worship." She's thinking, yeah, that'll tie him up for a bit. That'll get him off the subject of my past sexual misdemeanors. And what is interesting with Jesus is he doesn't say, whoa, non sequitur, come back. We were talking about something, it was really important. He lets the conversation run. Why does he do that? because the woman has unwittingly introduced the main topic. She's talking about worship. And he is effectively saying to her, your issues are stemming from this fact. You haven't figured out what you're here for, what you are here to worship. And then he goes on to show her that she is made to worship God, to worship Messiah. And then he says to her, I whom you seek am he. He says the great purpose in life is to have a relationship with him and to worship him. Neil Postman, in his book Amusing Ourselves to Death, compares the writings of George Orwell and Aldous Huxley. And he makes this very clever point about the fact that George Orwell in 1984 is concerned about the way that the state is going to manipulate us by terrorising us. But Aldous Huxley in Brave New World is more concerned about the way that the state is going to manipulate us by feeding us pleasure. And this is what he writes. Orwell feared we would become a captive culture. Huxley feared we would become a trivial culture, preoccupied with some equivalent of the feelies, the orgy-porgy, and the centrifugal bumble puppy. As Huxley remarked in Brave New World Revisited, the civil libertarians and rationalists who are ever on the alert to oppose tyranny failed to take into account man's almost infinite appetite for distraction. In 1984, Huxley's people are controlled by inflicting pain. In Brave New World, they're controlled by inflicting pleasure. In short, Orwell feared that what we hate will ruin us, whilst Huxley feared that what we love will ruin us. This book, he writes, is about the possibility that Huxley, and not Orwell, was right. Have you thought that our greatest problem could be that we're oppressed from within by our pursuit of pleasure outside of the moral framework that God has given us and with no sense of the great purpose to which he's called us? What is the greatest commandment Jesus has asked? He says to love the Lord your God with all your heart, mind, soul and strength. That is a life that matters. Nothing matters so much as that. And joy comes together when a person realizes the great purpose in their life, the right moral boundaries that God has given us, and we pursue pleasure within that framework. That is a joy inexpressible and filled with glory, and it's found in a relationship with Jesus Christ. Let me end with these words from a great theologian, Jonathan Edwards. He wrote about the inexpressible joy that comes from knowing Jesus Christ and pursuing pleasure within that context we've talked about. He writes, God is the highest good of the reasonable person. The enjoyment of him is our proper and is the only happiness with which our souls can be satisfied. To go to heaven, fully to enjoy God, is infinitely better than the most pleasant accommodations here. Better than fathers and mothers, husbands and wives or children, or the company of any or all of our earthly friends. For these are but shadows, but the enjoyment of God is the substance. These are but scattered beams. God is the sun. These are but streams. God is the fountain. These are but drops. God is the ocean. Are you living in the shadows, or are you basking in the sun? Are you drinking from the muddy stream? Are you relishing the delight of the ocean of your desires? Taste and see that the Lord is good. Thanks for listening.
Hello, we're going to come back together now and start the question and answer because we're running out of time a little bit. So, yeah, I'd like to welcome the panel. We've already met Pete, and if you were here yesterday lunchtime, you'll have met James and Andy as well, but they'll just introduce themselves quickly. Oh, and also, you can still text in questions, not too late. The number's there.
Hi, I'm Andy. I did a history degree a few years ago at Exeter College, and I now work in a church in North Oxford.
I'm James and I work at St Thames Church.
Thank you. First question. Most people agree that moral boundaries are necessary, but why do they have to be God's moral boundaries? Lots of biblical rules seem arbitrary, even immoral.
Yeah, thanks. It's a good question. I guess when people come to Christianity maybe for the first time, they see what might be moral boundaries that are different from the ones in our present culture, and that can feel strange. I suppose there's two things I'd say. Firstly, moral boundaries have changed culturally over the years, and so I think if we end up saying that simply our own culture's boundaries are the right ones, there is a huge arrogance in that, in essentially saying that we alone, as our culture in the present time in this part of the world, uniquely have it right. And so I think it's always good to be questioning our own culture's moral boundaries. Are we the one culture in all time, in all geography, that has it right? I think then when it comes to the question of God, I'm convinced God is the source of all good, largely because he's the creator. That's to say, he's made the world, and if he's made the world, he is the one who knows how it best works. I think that just follows on, actually, that the one who created the world is the one who knows how it is made in order that we should live in the best way. And so that's why I personally, both objectively and from my own experience, have confidence that God's moral boundaries are the best.
Just worth saying, with the final bit, lots of biblical rules seem arbitrary, even immoral. I think sometimes that's just when you first blush, but then actually if you explore them and try to understand the relationship of those moral boundaries, particularly to the culture in which they were written, and just try to be a bit more nuanced about a very old text and how you handle it, that often, in my experience, deals with a lot of those apparent objections. And so it's just worth handling it carefully, because the Bible is a very old book and needs to be carefully applied to the context in which we live today.
Thank you. Next question. If moral boundaries are good because they ultimately lead to more pleasure or fulfillment, surely Christianity, saying that pleasure is still... Wait, have I read that wrong? Surely that Christianity, saying that pleasure is still the ultimate good, is...
I think I understand that. So surely Christianity is saying that pleasure is still the ultimate good, which would be a problem. And no, that's not quite what Christianity is saying. Christianity is saying that moral boundaries are good, and actually that pleasure is a good thing, because God has created us, and he has created us in the way he's created us, with, pleasure receptors in our bodies and so on. He's created us not just as disembodied souls, excuse me, my voice is breaking, which is exciting. He's created us as embodied people, and pleasure is a good thing, as the Bible sees it, but that it's not the ultimate thing, and that when we seek pleasure as the ultimate thing, in fact what we find is we're grasping at something that it eludes us, because we were made for God, and we won't find true pleasure, true fulfillment outside of our relationship with God. So I was quoting C.S. Lewis to some students a bit earlier, last week, and he's got a very helpful quote on this, where he says, in trying to explain this dynamic in Christianity, he says this: if we consider the unblushing promises of reward and the staggering nature of the rewards promised in the gospel, in Christianity, it seems that God finds our desires not too strong but too weak. We're half-hearted creatures, he says, fooling about with drink and sex and ambition when infinite joy is offered us. Like the ignorant child who wants to go on making mud pies in a slum, because they cannot imagine what is meant by the offer of a holiday at the sea. We're far too easily pleased. He's just making the point that if we reach for pleasure as the ultimate end, we'll miss it. But if we seek God, then wonderfully we'll find that joy becomes ours.
The talk concentrated a lot on immoral pleasure. What if the pleasure I pursue is essentially moral, e.g. spending time with my family, doing volunteer work? Am I still damaging myself by pursuing those things?
Thank you. I think it comes back to what James was just saying. Was what I was trying to suggest was that the Bible sees it much more integrated. It doesn't make pleasure the supreme good, but rather pleasure is part of the equation, but also is living according to God's great purpose. So God has a higher agenda for your life, and that is realized in a relationship with him, to worship the Lord God. That is the ultimate reason that we're all here, and if we don't realize that, there's a sense in which we're all missing the ultimate purpose behind our lives. It doesn't render our lives worthless, but it does mean we're missing the point. And so, I think that spending time with the family, doing volunteer work is great, But all of these things, remember, I'm suggesting they're integrated. The pursuit of pleasure, the pursuit of ultimate purpose in God, and doing it within God's good moral boundaries. Those three things come together in what the Bible calls joy or blessing. So, yeah, that's what I was suggesting in the talk, just to be clear.
The woman in the well story was a home wrecker. But is sex in a loving and committed relationship really that destructive?
Yeah, it's a good question. God is the source of all things that are good, and so God is the source of the good gift that is sex. I guess many people have the impression that Christians regard sex as an evil or a bad thing. Actually, Christians regard sex as such a precious thing that they want to follow God's instructions as to the best environment for that, which is marriage. I guess sex seems to be that thing that glues a committed relationship together. So sex in a loving and committed relationship is good. And it seems to me the best way to show that relationship is loving and committed is within the context of marriage, and the Bible celebrates that.
But what if we give in to these pleasures with the knowledge we'll be forgiven?
Well, the Bible says that once we've come to understand the message of the gospel and we've come to grasp it for ourselves, and we understand that Jesus came and he didn't hold anything back, but he gave his life in order that we might be forgiven. That actually, although it's true that the sins that we will commit will be forgiven if we come to him and put our trust in him, that is absolutely true. Nonetheless, the reality of understanding what the Bible is saying does something to the heart. And what it does to the heart is it changes us from being people who think, well, it would be great to sin because we can get away with it, we'll have forgiveness, to being people who, yes, at times obviously still find sin attractive, but actually deep down, at the deepest possible level of our being, want to please God.
And I'm afraid that's all we've got time for. So thank you very much to our question panel.